He shut off my water to remind me who's in charge. So I bought the well and made him pay rent for every drop. I used to think power meant titles, meetings, and signatures on paper. But that morning, I learned what power really was. Watching your child hold an empty cup and realizing you can't even fill it. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I live in Maple Ridge, a quiet suburban neighborhood that looks perfect from the outside. White fences, trimmed lawns, and a homeowners association that promised community harmony. They never told us harmony came with a leash. It was one of those scorching July mornings when the air feels heavy and the pavement shimmers. I'd just finished watering the flowers on the porch when the hose hissed, coughed, and went dry. I frowned, twisted the nozzle, and heard nothing but air wheezing out. I tried the kitchen faucet, it sputtered twice, then fell silent. Not a drop. My stomach dropped with it. At first I thought it was a neighborhood issue, maybe a burst main or maintenance, but when I stepped outside the world looked off. The usual morning calm was broken by murmurs, blinds half open, heads peeking through windows. Then I saw the white truck parked near the entrance, marked Maple Ridge HOA Maintenance. Two men, in reflective vests, were crouched near the main valve box, and one of them smirked when our eyes met. "Excuse me," I shouted, walking over. "Is there a water issue?" He didn't even look up. "Talk to the president, ma'am." The president, Richard Hale. A man who wore power like armor. Late 50s, always in pressed polos and mirrored sunglasses, with a voice that dripped superiority. He lived 2 streets down and loved reminding everyone that he kept this community in order. I marched straight to his house. He was already outside, clipboard in hand, sipping coffee like a man admiring his own kingdom. "Richard," I called, trying to stay calm. "My water's off. What's going on?" He adjusted his glasses and gave that rehearsed smile that never reached his eyes. "Ah, Mrs. Mitchell. Yes, I was just about to inform you. According to our latest meter readings, your household exceeded the community usage limit." I blinked. "Usage limit? That's not even in the bylaws." He shrugged. "New policy. We voted on it last week." I wasn't informed. "You should have attended the meeting," he said, turning his back like the conversation was over. I felt the heat crawling up my neck. "You can't just shut off my water, Richard. That's not legal." He chuckled under his breath. "It's not personal, Sarah. It's community regulation. You'll get it back once you've paid your fines." "Fines?" I stepped closer. "For watering my flowers?" He tilted his head, smirking. "For non-compliance." Then he walked off, leaving me standing in the sun with anger pounding in my chest. By the time I got home, my daughter, Lily, was crying. "Mom, the toilet won't flush." My husband Mark was on the phone with the city, who told him the water lines were privately managed, under HOA authority, meaning Richard Hale held the switch. The house felt lifeless without water. Dishes stacked, sweat sticking to our skin, the faint metallic scent of dry pipes filling the air. Every faucet hissed like it was mocking us. I tried to stay calm for Lily, but inside, shame and fury were twisting together. Later that afternoon, I noticed neighbors whispering near the mailbox. One of them, Ella Roberts, quietly waved me over. She looked nervous. "Sarah, they posted your name on the board," she whispered. I followed her to the clubhouse wall. There it was, a laminated notice under bold red letters. Non-compliance, Sarah Mitchell. Water violation. People passing by glanced at it, then looked away. Nobody spoke. It was like being branded. My throat tightened, but I refused to let tears fall. Richard's rules thrived on humiliation, on making you feel small enough to obey. I stood there, staring at that paper, my hands shaking. I'd lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, paid every due, followed every petty rule about mailbox color, fence height, and lawn edges. But this was war. That night, the air was thick and still. Mark and Lily were asleep, and I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the sink. The same sink where I used to hum while washing dishes, where life once felt normal. I thought about Richard's smirk, the way he'd turned his back on me, like I was beneath him. Then a sound pulled me from my thoughts. The creak of footsteps on the porch. I walked to the door, heart pounding, and there it was, a bright red notice pinned to the wood. Utilities suspended indefinitely. Non-compliance subject to penalty. I gripped the paper until it tore. The rage that filled me wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, cold. I didn't know it yet, but that night was the beginning of something much bigger than a water shutoff. It was the start of a fight I never asked for, one I was going to finish. That night, as I stared at the dry sink, a red notice appeared on my door. Utilities suspended indefinitely. The next morning, the air in Maple Ridge felt heavier than usual, like the entire neighborhood knew what had happened, but no one dared to mention it. I could feel the eyes on me when I stepped outside. Curtains fluttered, doors shut quickly. The same people I'd shared barbecues and school fundraisers with now looked at me like I'd done something wrong. And standing at the center of it all was Richard Hale, the man who turned neighborly order into dictatorship. He'd once been a corporate manager before retiring early, and he carried that same smug, commanding tone wherever he went. He spoke like every sentence deserved applause. The HOA wasn't a volunteer group to him, it was his kingdom, and we were his subjects. That morning, he was striding down the street, clipboard in hand, checking lawns like a general inspecting his troops. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but you could feel his stare, judging, calculating. He stopped when he saw me. "Morning, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, pretending politeness. "I hope the water situation taught you something about conservation." I clenched my jaw. "You had no right to cut my water, Richard." He smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Oh, I assure you, I have every right. The board approved it." "There is no board, Richard. It's just you and whoever's too scared to disagree." That made him laugh. A dry mocking sound that echoed down the street. "You might want to watch your tone. Non-compliance can get expensive." I could feel my pulse in my throat, but before I could respond, a few neighbors stepped out, pretending to water their plants or check their mail. He wanted an audience. He wanted to humiliate me. "Tell me, Mrs. Mitchell," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "How's your garden doing without all that extra water? Must be hard to maintain without bending the rules." I felt the burn of embarrassment crawl up my neck. My flowers, once bright and full, were already wilting in the heat. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was a bully hiding behind bylaws. But I just said, "I'll figure it out." He gave a satisfied nod, turned on his heel, and walked away. That's when I realized, this wasn't about water. It was about control. He wanted submission. Over the next few days, the harassment began. It started with envelopes, thin official-looking ones stamped with notice of violation. The first one claimed my grass was half an inch above HOA regulation. The next accused me of having an unauthorized paint color on my shutters, the same color approved 3 years earlier. Then came the absurd one: unregistered hose equipment visible from public view. A garden hose, apparently, had become a crime. Each letter carried a fine: $50, $100, $200. The numbers climbed faster than my temper. Mark tried to calm me, his voice steady but tired. "Let's not give him what he wants, Sarah. He's baiting you. He's abusing power," I snapped. "There has to be a law against this." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe, but we don't have the money to fight him. He knows that." He was right. That was Richard's real weapon. He didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. He just buried people in paperwork, drained their patience, and watched them break. A few days later, I saw him again, this time at the mail kiosk. He was chatting with 2 residents, both nodding like loyal soldiers. When I approached, their smiles faded. Richard turned to me, voice dripping with false sympathy. "Still having those water issues, Mrs. Mitchell?" "I'm handling it," I said quietly. He leaned closer. "You know, if you'd just followed the guidelines, none of this would have happened. We can't make exceptions. Rules are rules." I met his stare. "You don't enforce rules, Richard. You invent them." That made his smile falter, just for a second, before he recovered. "Careful, Sarah. People who fight the system usually regret it." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. That night, I sat at the dining table surrounded by violation letters. The pile looked like a wall between me and my own home. I opened my laptop, searching for anything. Laws, regulations, rights. Hours passed in silence except for the tapping of keys and the creak of the old chair. Finally, I stumbled upon something that made my heart pound. HOAs can fine residents for violations, but under state law they cannot restrict or terminate essential utilities such as water or electricity. So Richard had broken the law. Flat out. I leaned back, staring at the screen, my anger replaced by clarity. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was illegal. And if I could prove it, he wouldn't just lose his authority. He could lose everything. But then something odd caught my eye. I reached for the HOA handbook. The thick binder Richard had proudly handed to every resident during move-in. I flipped through the pages, scanning the section on community services and utility management. It should have outlined every rule and policy. But there was a gap. Pages 47 through 49 were missing, cleanly torn out. I froze, my hand still on the paper. Why would those specific pages be gone? And what had they said? The next morning, I would find out that those missing pages were the key to everything. The first crack in Richard Hale's perfect empire. When I opened the HOA handbook that night, one missing page told me everything I needed to know. Sleep had become impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's smirk and the red notice nailed to my door. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper behind all this. Something buried, just out of sight. The missing pages from the HOA handbook kept echoing in my mind. What was so important that Richard had torn them out? The next morning, after Mark left for work, I drove downtown to the county recorder's office. It was an old sandstone building that smelled of dust and copier ink. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the rhythmic clacking of keyboards. Rows of file cabinets stretched down narrow aisles, each one packed with the history of our town. When I approached the counter, a woman with half-moon glasses looked up from her screen. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said, trying to sound calm. "I need property and utility ownership records for Maple Ridge HOA. Specifically, anything tied to water or well management." She raised an eyebrow. "That's public information, but it'll take some time to pull." "That's fine," I replied, setting my hands on the counter. "I'll wait." As she disappeared into the back room, I sat in one of the worn-out chairs by the window. Outside, sunlight bounced off the courthouse steps. I could almost hear Richard's voice in my head, telling me to let it go. But that wasn't happening. 15 minutes later, the woman returned with a thick folder, dust rising as she set it down. "Everything tied to the Maple Ridge subdivision, water and land rights included," she said. I thanked her, my fingers trembling slightly as I opened the first binder. The sound of rustling pages filled the quiet room. I skimmed past maintenance records, meeting minutes, and signatures from decades ago. Nothing unusual. Until one title caught my eye. Well Site Lease Agreement, Maple Ridge Development. I frowned. Lease? Not ownership? I leaned closer. The document was dated nearly 20 years ago. It listed the original developer of the neighborhood as the lessee, Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. But the lessor was something else. The Greenwood Land Trust. The trust name was unfamiliar, but one section made my heart skip. It clearly stated that the HOA didn't own the water source, they only leased the land and rights to draw from the well for 20 years. And then I saw it. Lease expiration date, July 1st. I checked the calendar on my phone. June 9th. Less than 3 weeks away. My pulse quickened. If that lease expired, the HOA would lose all rights to the well unless they renewed it. Which meant, for the first time, Richard's control wasn't absolute. I flipped through more pages, confirming the signatures. The lease was legitimate, recorded, notarized, and binding. My breath came faster as I realized what this meant. Richard had been acting like a king over something he didn't even own. A voice broke through my thoughts. "You okay, honey?" The clerk had noticed me frozen over the document. I nodded slowly. "Yeah." I just found something interesting. She smiled faintly. You'd be surprised what turns up in these old files. Most folks don't realize county utility records are public. Anyone can trace ownership if they just look. Her words hit like a spark. Anyone can trace ownership. It was like she'd handed me a weapon. I copied the lease, paying a few dollars for certified duplicates. The machine beeped softly, printing my proof. Black and white pages that suddenly felt like armor. For weeks I'd been powerless, but now for the first time the tide was turning. Driving home I replayed everything in my head. The humiliation, the fines, the whispers. Richard had built his entire empire on a foundation that didn't belong to him. And in less than a month that foundation would crumble. When I reached my house, I sat in the driveway for a long time, gripping the folder in my lap. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. My hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but from adrenaline. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something new. Hope. Not the fragile kind that fades when the lights go out, but the steady, rising kind that comes from knowing the truth. Still, one question haunted me. If I could find this record, then surely Richard knew too. Which meant he'd do anything to keep that lease renewal quiet and keep control. I looked down at the document one more time. The ink was faded, but one line burned into my vision, sealing my next move. Lease expiration, July 1st. That date wasn't just paperwork, it was a countdown. One line in that dusty document stopped my breath. Lease expiration, July 1st. That was 3 weeks away. The next morning, I couldn't stop staring at that lease document. The words Greenwood Land Trust echoed in my head like a riddle waiting to be solved. If they owned the well, then somewhere out there was a person who could decide who controlled the water. Not Richard. I just had to find them before he did. I spent the entire day digging through property records, tracing every name tied to the trust. Most led nowhere. Dissolved companies, outdated addresses, empty office lots. But one listing stopped me cold. The last known trustee was Harold Thompson, a retired farmer who lived 30 miles outside town. His name wasn't just printed on the lease. It was signed in fading ink at the very bottom. That signature meant he held the authority Richard could never fake. I drove out to his ranch the following afternoon. The sun was low, casting an orange glow over endless acres of wheat. A rusty mailbox leaned to one side, the paint nearly gone. The air smelled of oil and soil. Real, living earth. Not the manicured lawns and sprayed hedges of Maple Ridge. I parked near the barn and stepped out, clutching my folder. An old man emerged from the shadows, wiping his hands on a rag. His gray beard caught the light like silver wire. "You lost, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gravelly but kind. "No, sir," I said. "Are you Harold Thompson?" "Depends who's asking. My name's Sarah Mitchell. I live in Maple Ridge. I believe you leased land to our homeowners association about 20 years ago. The well site off Willow Creek Road." He froze mid-step, narrowing his eyes. "That old mess? Don't tell me they're still making trouble over there." I managed a nervous smile. "More than ever. They've been cutting off people's water. Mine included," he sighed, rubbing his chin. "Figures. That HOA's been nothing but headaches since I signed that deal. Thought I was doing something good, keeping the development supplied. But they've turned it into a circus." He motioned toward the porch. "Come on in. Let's talk inside." The farmhouse creaked with age, filled with the scent of pine and old paper. Yellowed photos lined the walls. Harvest seasons, family portraits, a lifetime of work. On the table sat stacks of worn files, rubber bands holding them together. "I still got my copy of that lease," he said, pulling one binder free. "Haven't looked at it in years." He flipped through it, and there it was. The same document I'd seen at the recorder's office. "I couldn't help but notice," I said quietly. "It expires in 3 weeks." He gave a tired nod. "Yep, I was gonna let it run out. Didn't see any point renewing with them folks. They stopped paying attention years ago." My heart was pounding. Mr. Thompson, what happens when it expires? He leaned back, thoughtful. Technically, the land and the well rights revert back to me. I could lease it to someone else or sell it outright. The words hung in the air. Sell it outright. Would you consider selling? I asked, voice trembling slightly. To me? He looked up sharply, studying me for a long moment. You? Yes, I said. I'm not trying to exploit it. I just want to stop the HOA from controlling people's lives. If I own the well, I can make sure they can't abuse it anymore. He didn't answer at first. Then he chuckled softly, shaking his head. You've got more guts than most folks I've met from that place. He stood, walked to a drawer and pulled out a folded paper. Truth is, I'm too old for more fights. If you're serious, we can draw something up. That's when reality hit. This wasn't just a bold idea. This was a life-changing gamble. That night, Mark and I sat at the kitchen table with our savings spread out. Bank statements, small certificates, a few old bonds we'd been keeping for Lily's future. Sarah, this is everything, he said quietly. If this goes wrong, we could lose it all. I looked him in the eye. We're already losing everything if we let him keep doing this. He didn't argue again. We signed the withdrawal forms the next morning. 2 days later, I returned to Harold's ranch. The paperwork was ready. The same smell of earth, the same quiet hum of cicadas outside. He laid out the documents, his old fountain pen resting on the table between us. Once this is signed, he said, it's yours. The land, the rights, and the headaches that come with it. My hand shook slightly as I picked up the pen. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of what this moment meant. For weeks, I'd been at the mercy of a man who thought he could own me. Now, I was about to take back what he stole. Not just water, but control, dignity, freedom. I pressed the pen to the paper, the faint scratch of ink filling the silence. When the pen touched paper, I didn't just buy a well, I bought back my dignity. For 2 weeks, I kept the purchase secret. Not even Ella, my closest neighbor, knew what I'd done. Every morning, I'd drive past the well site, feeling a strange mix of fear and power bubbling inside me. The smell of damp soil, the hum of the pumps, the way the morning light hit the metal casing. It all felt different now because it was mine. Harold's signature, the county seal, every line of that deed said so. Richard, of course, had no clue. He went on ruling the neighborhood like a petty dictator. Violation letters kept coming, now accusing me of obstruction of community operations. His arrogance only confirmed one thing. He had no idea the ground beneath his feet had shifted. Then, one evening, a notice slid under my door. It was printed in bold font. Mandatory HOA meeting. Water policy violations and penalties. It was signed, of course, by Richard Hale, HOA President. I knew what this was. A show of power. An attempt to humiliate me again. Only this time, I wasn't the one walking in defenseless. The clubhouse was packed that night. The air was thick with murmurs, the faint smell of coffee and tension hanging between rows of plastic chairs. The entire board sat at a long table near the front, their faces stiff and self-important. Richard stood in the center, wearing a navy blazer and his usual smug confidence. "Thank you all for coming," he began, tapping the microphone. "We're here to discuss repeated instances of water misuse and violations of the new community conservation policy." His tone was calm, rehearsed, the kind of voice that tries to sound fair but carries venom underneath. I sat in the second row, silent. I could feel eyes on me. Everyone knew who he meant. He continued, reading from his clipboard. "Certain residents have chosen to disregard the rules. Excessive lawn watering, unauthorized irrigation, and personal use of community resources, all direct violations." He paused, scanning the crowd before his gaze landed squarely on me. "As a result, the HOA will be implementing additional fines and potential service restrictions." I rose from my seat slowly. "Mr. Hale," I said, my voice steady, "before you proceed, I'd like to make a clarification about those resources you mentioned." He looked annoyed. "Mrs. Mitchell, This isn't the time for interruptions. It's exactly the time, I replied, because you've been enforcing penalties based on a claim that isn't true. The room stirred. He frowned, straightening. And what claim would that be? That the HOA owns the well. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Richard tried to laugh, but it came out strained. Of course we do. It's written into the community infrastructure agreements. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. Actually, it isn't. I checked. I went to the county recorder's office. I held up the documents, the paper trembling slightly in my hand, but not my voice. This water source you've been controlling isn't owned by the HOA. It was leased 20 years ago from a private land trust. That lease expired this month, and as of last week, I took a deep breath. I am the new owner. The silence that followed was electric. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the creak of chairs as people turned toward me. Richard froze. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely caught off guard. That's impossible, he muttered. You can't just… I can, I interrupted. And I did. The sale is legal, recorded, and notarized. Under county law, HOAs must operate only under recorded covenants. You can't claim ownership of property or utilities beyond what's in those documents. Someone in the back clapped softly. Then another. Soon the room was alive with murmurs and half-smiles. Neighbors exchanging looks of disbelief and quiet satisfaction. Richard's face turned red, the smugness gone, replaced by something darker, rage. His hands gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. You think this changes anything? He hissed. You think you can just walk in here and rewrite the rules? I met his glare. No, Richard, I'm not rewriting them. I'm just reminding you who they apply to. He didn't respond. He couldn't. The power he'd used to humiliate me, to threaten families, to control every drop of water. It was gone. In one stroke of ink, I'd taken it all back. The meeting ended abruptly. People shuffled out, whispering, some patting me on the shoulder. I stayed seated for a while, letting the weight of it all sink in. For the first time in weeks, I felt taller, lighter, free. But as I gathered my papers, I looked up and caught Richard watching me from the doorway. His expression wasn't defeat, it was calculation. His lips curled into a thin, chilling smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. But instead of surrendering, he smiled. A cold smile that told me this was far from over. For a few days after the meeting, peace returned to Maple Ridge. People waved at me again, the tension around the neighborhood easing like a wound finally starting to heal. For the first time in months, I slept soundly. Until the retaliation began. It started small, subtle enough to make me question if it was coincidence. The first letter arrived the following Monday, notice of violation, unapproved garden modification. The next day, another, trash container visibility violation. Then one about my fence being 1 inch above height regulation. By the end of the week, there were 6 letters piled on my kitchen counter. Each came with a fine, each signed personally by Richard Hale. He hadn't accepted defeat. He was declaring war. The next morning, I opened my front door to find trash scattered across my lawn. Ripped garbage bags, rotting fruit, and crushed soda cans. The stench was overwhelming, thick and sour in the rising heat. Lily's bike tires crunched over broken glass. Mark came outside, his expression tightening as he looked at the mess. Coincidence? He asked quietly. I shook my head. Richard's making sure I remember who I embarrassed. We spent the morning cleaning, neither of us speaking, but later that day, the next hit came. Mark's car, the one he used to commute to work, sat in the driveway with a long, jagged scratch carved deep into the paint. Someone had keyed it from front to back. Our mailbox was dented, hanging half open like a broken jaw. I called the police, but the officer could only shrug. Without proof, ma'am, there's not much we can do. Could be kids. Kids didn't sign violation letters. Kids didn't know the HOA bylaws by heart. The next week was worse. Every morning, another envelope. Every night, Another small act of sabotage. A sprinkler mysteriously broken. Window egged. Footsteps in the yard after midnight. I started leaving lights on just to feel less exposed. What cut deepest wasn't the damage. It was the silence. Neighbors who had smiled at me just days before now avoided eye contact. I could see curtains move when I stepped outside. Whispers following me to the mailbox. A few kind souls like Ella still checked in quietly, dropping off cookies or leaving short notes. Hang in there. We know what he's doing. But no one dared to stand beside me in public. Richard's strategy was working. Isolation, make the target look crazy, then bury them under rules until they break. One afternoon, he took it a step further. A notice appeared on my door marked urgent, community disturbance complaint. Apparently, I was being accused of creating division and hostility within the neighborhood. The letter ended with a threat. Failure to comply with behavioral guidelines may result in further sanctions. Behavioral guidelines. I laughed out loud, a sound that came out sharp and cracked. He was weaponizing the same system that was supposed to protect residents. That night, I sat in the dark living room, the air heavy with frustration. Mark sat across from me, rubbing his eyes. "We can't keep doing this, Sarah," he said softly. "He's not going to stop. He's not the law," I whispered. "He's pretending to be. You've proved your point. You own the well. Why not just—" "No," I cut him off. "If I stop now, he wins. And next time, it'll be someone else. Maybe Ella. Maybe a new family who doesn't know what he's capable of." He didn't argue after that. Later, I pulled out my laptop again, determined to find something concrete. Something that would make Richard's behavior not just wrong, but illegal. It didn't take long. Buried deep within a property rights forum, I found it. Selective enforcement and targeted harassment by an HOA can be grounds for a civil lawsuit. That sentence pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat. There it was, legal nugget under state law. Any HOA engaging in harassment or selective enforcement is vulnerable to civil action. He thought he could drown me in fines. But every letter he sent, every citation he fabricated, was now evidence. The next day, I began keeping a log. Every envelope, every date, every noise in the night. I wasn't scared anymore. I was documenting a case. Still, paranoia crept in. Some nights I'd wake up convinced I heard footsteps outside, only to find nothing but shadows and wind. But on the third night, I wasn't imagining it. It was past midnight when I saw it. A beam of light cutting through the trees behind my house. Slow, deliberate. Someone was out there. I stepped closer to the window, heart pounding, the faint glow moving toward the old well. A figure in dark clothes crouched near the pump, flashlight shaking slightly in their hand. For a moment, I froze. Then anger overtook fear. Richard Hale wasn't done. He was escalating. That's when I saw someone near the well, in the dead of night, flashlight in hand. After that night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps. Every flicker of light outside made my pulse race. Whoever had been near the well wasn't just curious. They were deliberate, careful, like someone who knew what they were looking for. And deep down, I already knew who sent them. At dawn, I walked out to the well. The morning air was cold, the grass damp beneath my feet. The lock on the valve box was scratched, and the ground around it looked freshly disturbed. Whoever came here hadn't finished what they started. I knelt down, brushing away the dirt, and made a promise to myself. If Richard wanted a war of evidence, I was done playing defense. By noon, I was at a local hardware store, buying 2 motion-activated security cameras. I made sure they were the kind that triggered with movement and uploaded footage directly to a cloud server. Mark helped me mount them around the well and the back fence line, angled carefully so they covered the valves and pump area. "Are we even allowed to do this?" he asked, tightening one of the brackets. "Yes," I said. "As long as it's my property and doesn't record private interiors, it's perfectly legal." That night, as the last light faded, the cameras blinked red. Active. I sat by the window, watching the live feed on my laptop. For hours, nothing happened, just the rustle of trees and the soft glow of streetlights. By midnight, exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep on the couch. The alert woke me just before 3 a.m. The notification tone was sharp, slicing through the silence. Motion detected, north perimeter. I clicked the feed, heart pounding. The screen flickered, then came into focus. A man in dark clothes crouched near the pump. The camera's night vision cast his figure in pale gray light. He was wearing gloves, fumbling with the lock. Then he turned slightly and I saw his face. Not Richard, but Tom Becker, the HOA's handyman. He pried open the valve cover, twisting at something inside. Then the video cut. The feed timed out as the system reset. For a few seconds, I just stared at the frozen image. Proof. Real, undeniable proof. My throat went dry. The next morning, I drove straight to Richard's house. He was trimming his hedges, perfectly calm, like a man without a care in the world. When he saw me, his expression flickered with annoyance. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, setting down the clippers. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "You sent someone to my well last night," I said flatly. He blinked, feigning confusion. "I beg your pardon?" "Your handyman, Tom Becker. I have him on video tampering with the valve." Richard's smile didn't falter. "That's a bold accusation. Do you have proof?" "I do," I said. "And I'm taking it to the sheriff." His jaw twitched, but he kept his voice calm. "You're making a mistake, Sarah. Stirring up trouble like this only hurts the community." I didn't respond. I just turned and walked away, my hands trembling. Not from fear, but fury. At the county sheriff's office, I met Deputy Cole Sanders, a tall man with tired eyes but a kind demeanor. I showed him the footage, explaining everything from the start. The water shutoff, the fines, the trespassing. He watched the clip in silence, then leaned back in his chair. "This is solid," he said. "You said the well's on your property?" "Yes. Fully deeded and recorded." "Then that's tampering with private utility infrastructure," he said, jotting notes. "That's a criminal offense under state law. We'll open an investigation." Hearing those words, criminal offense, sent a strange mix of relief and fear through me. It wasn't just me anymore. Now the law was watching. Over the next 2 days, Cole visited the neighborhood, quietly interviewing a few residents. Word spread fast, and by midweek a small local reporter showed up at my door. She introduced herself from the Maple County Gazette, asking if I was willing to share my side of the story off the record. I hesitated. "How did you even hear about this?" "Anonymous tip," she said with a knowing look. "But I think you already know who didn't want this story told." I agreed to talk. Carefully. Not for fame, not for spite, but because I was tired of being silenced. By the time she left, my hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from weakness. It was from the weight of momentum. Things were finally moving. That night, I sat on the porch with Mark. The air was cool, crickets singing in the distance. "Do you think this will stop him?" he asked quietly. "No," I said, watching the lights flicker across the neighborhood. "Not yet. But he's not untouchable anymore." I was right. The next phase was coming. Not silence, but retaliation from a different front. Legal nugget. Tampering with private utility infrastructure is a criminal offense under state law, punishable by fines and prosecution. 3 days later, as I sorted the morning mail, an envelope caught my eye. Thick paper, embossed seal. HOA Legal Division, confidential communication. I opened it slowly, my stomach twisting. Inside was a letter printed in bold. "Mrs. Mitchell, you are hereby requested to attend an urgent HOA meeting to address ongoing allegation." 3 days later, I received a letter from the HOA's attorney demanding an urgent meeting. The letter from the HOA's attorney was short, but it carried a weight that settled deep in my chest. An urgent meeting regarding ongoing allegations. I knew what it meant. Richard was cornered, and when a man like him feels trapped, he doesn't back down. He doubles down. 3 days later, I found myself walking into the Maple County Council Hall. The place felt more like a courtroom than a community building. High ceilings, polished floors, rows of chairs filled with residents, whispering to each other. The air buzzed with curiosity and tension. Some were here for the drama, others to finally see justice catch up to Richard Hale. At the front sat the five-member council, their nameplates lined neatly in a row. To their right, the HOA delegation, Richard, his attorney, and two board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. And on the left, attorney Lisa Monroe, the woman I'd hired after Deputy Sanders suggested I needed representation. She was sharp, mid-30s, with calm confidence in every step she took. When I'd first met Lisa, she'd looked over my documents and smiled faintly. "If everything here checks out, Mrs. Mitchell, he's finished. Just keep your answers short, factual, and calm. Let the evidence do the talking." That morning, her words echoed in my mind like a mantra. The council chair, an older man named Councilman Reeves, called the session to order. "We're here to review the dispute between the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association and resident Sarah Mitchell regarding utility ownership and allegations of harassment." Richard's lawyer stood first, adjusting his tie. "Council members, my client, Mr. Hale, has acted solely within his duties as HOA President. The well in question has served the community for 2 decades under established agreements. Mrs. Mitchell's recent actions, purchasing the property and restricting access, constitute interference with community assets." He paused dramatically, letting the words interference and community assets hang in the air. Lisa stood slowly, calm as a surgeon about to make the first incision. "With respect, council members, that's inaccurate. The HOA has never owned the well. It was leased from a private trust, which expired this year. My client, Mrs. Mitchell, legally purchased both the land and utility rights before expiration. She is not interfering with community property. She owns it." Richard shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Lisa continued, her tone cutting through the tension. "Furthermore, we have evidence of intentional tampering at the well site by an HOA employee, acting under Mr. Hale's direction." The room murmured. Richard's lawyer started to object, but Reeves raised a hand. "We'll see the evidence first." Lisa nodded to me. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the remote and pressed play. The footage appeared on the projector. A grainy night vision video showing Tom Becker crouched at the valve box. The timestamp, the location, the face. All clear. When the flashlight beam revealed the HOA uniform logo on his jacket, there was a collective intake of breath. Gasps rippled through the room. Even the council members exchanged looks. Richard's face had gone pale, his usual smug composure cracking like porcelain. Lisa spoke again, her voice firm. "This footage was submitted to the county sheriff, who verified the location and timestamp. This act constitutes tampering with private utility infrastructure, a criminal offense under state law." Reeves leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Hale, how do you respond to this?" Richard stood abruptly, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "Those are baseless claims. That man acted alone. She's trying to dismantle the HOA." Lisa didn't even flinch. "Then perhaps you can explain why the HOA's official letterhead was used to issue over a dozen false citations to Mrs. Mitchell in the same week this footage was recorded." Silence. The council conferred quietly among themselves for several minutes. Every second stretched like an hour. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Finally, Reeves cleared his throat. "It's evident that the HOA, under Mr. Hale's direction, has exceeded its authority. The well and the land on which it sits are legally owned by Mrs. Mitchell. The HOA has no jurisdiction to restrict, fine, or penalize her regarding its use." Richard sank back into his chair, his knuckles white against the table. His lawyer whispered something, but he didn't respond. His eyes met mine, full of hate, the kind that burns hotter when power slips away. Reeves turned toward me. His tone softened, just slightly. "Mrs. Mitchell, the county recognizes your ownership. Effective immediately, all HOA actions against you related to this property are null and void. Lisa placed a gentle hand on my arm, her expression calm but victorious. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Legal nugget. An HOA cannot restrict access to legally acquired resources or claim ownership beyond what is recorded in county covenants. But before I could even savor the victory, Reeves added something that sent a chill down my spine. Given the seriousness of these findings, we'll be forwarding this case for further review. There may be criminal implications. As the gavels struck the table, the crowd buzzed, half in shock, half in quiet applause. Richard didn't move. He just stared at me with that hollow, burning look. A man watching his empire collapse, already plotting its rebuild. When the room began to empty, Reeves leaned forward, his words deliberate and final. The councilman leaned forward and said, "Mrs. Mitchell, this well belongs to you now." The morning after the council hearing, Maple Ridge woke to a sound it hadn't heard in months. The steady hiss of running water. Faucets sputtered back to life, lawns drank deeply, and laughter echoed faintly from backyards again. I stood by my kitchen sink, hand under the stream, just watching it flow. Simple, ordinary, but this time, it felt like a victory worth every sleepless night. Word spread quickly. Within days, neighbors began to gather near the clubhouse. Not in fear this time, but in cautious gratitude. They wanted to know what came next, how the community would function now that the HOA's control over the water was gone. The council had confirmed my ownership beyond question, and the responsibility that came with it wasn't one I took lightly. That weekend, I called a community meeting. Open to everyone, no rules, no titles. We met outside near the fountain, the one that had been dry for so long it had become a symbol of Richard's reign. Now it was running again, clear and bright beneath the sunlight. I stood in front of the small crowd, my voice steady but humble. I didn't fight this battle to own something you need. I fought it because no one should have control over what keeps us alive. But maintaining the well, the pumps, the distribution, it costs money. So I've worked with the county to set a fair usage fee, equal for every household, monitored publicly. There were murmurs, not of protest, but of relief. A man in the back nodded. "That's fair," he said. Others agreed. For the first time in months, people were talking to each other instead of whispering behind closed doors. Even those who'd avoided me before began to approach. Ella hugged me tight, tears in her eyes. "You did what none of us could, Sarah. You stood up to him." I smiled faintly. I just got tired of being scared. The local paper ran a headline that week. "Homeowner wins water war against HOA President." A reporter from the county news channel showed up 2 days later, microphone in hand, filming interviews near the newly repaired well. When she asked how it felt to be called a local hero, I didn't know what to say. Hero wasn't the right word. I hadn't fought for glory. I'd fought for sanity, for peace, for the right to drink a glass of water without permission. Still, it was surreal watching my story on television that night. My name flashed on the screen beneath footage of the well, of families watering lawns, of kids running through sprinklers again. But for all the praise, there was still a shadow hanging over Maple Ridge. Richard Hale. After the council ruling, he'd vanished from public life. The once arrogant man who used to march the streets with his clipboard was now nowhere to be seen. His house stood dark most nights. Some said he was consulting lawyers. Others whispered that he was preparing to move. But I knew better. Richard wasn't the kind of man who disappeared quietly. Meanwhile, life slowly rebuilt itself. The air felt lighter. Laughter returned, and I finally found peace in my home again. I even planted new flowers in the front yard, ones that bloomed in defiance of every regulation he'd ever tried to enforce. Still, there were moments late at night when I'd look out at the street and feel that uneasy hum again, like calm before a storm. Power doesn't die easily. It hides, regroups, waits. Legal nugget: private utility owners can lease access under state supervision, ensuring fair use while maintaining lawful ownership. I tried to ignore that feeling, tried to believe the worst was over. But then, one Friday evening, as the sun sank low behind the rooftops, I heard the familiar flap of paper against my door. I opened it, and there it was, a single white envelope, handwritten, unmarked. The handwriting was neat, sharp, deliberate. The return name froze my breath, Richard Hale, until a letter arrived at my doorstep, this time from Richard himself. The letter sat on my kitchen table for nearly an hour before I opened it. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. After everything I'd endured, the fines, the humiliation, the hearing, a part of me still feared what Richard Hale could do. And when I finally tore the envelope open, that fear came rushing back. It wasn't a threat. It was worse. Inside was a formal notice of legal action. Richard was suing me for defamation and fraud, claiming that my statements to the media had irreparably damaged his reputation and standing in the community. The words blurred as I read them. He was demanding restitution, hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages, money we didn't have. Mark read over my shoulder, his voice tight. "He's trying to ruin us, Sarah." I nodded, my throat dry. "He's trying to make me back down." Again. But this wasn't just another HOA citation I could ignore. If the case went to court and somehow went his way, I could lose the well, my savings, even our home. The victory that had felt so complete suddenly seemed fragile, like a glass about to crack. I called Lisa Monroe immediately. She listened quietly as I read the letter to her over the phone. Then she said something that cut through my panic. "If he's pushing this hard, it's because he's hiding something bigger. Give me a few days, I'll find it." Those days dragged by like months. I could barely eat, barely sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. Every knock on the door sent my stomach lurching. It wasn't just the fear of losing. It was the exhaustion of fighting the same man over and over again. Then one afternoon Lisa called. Her voice was sharp, excited, almost triumphant. "Sarah, you need to come to my office, now." When I arrived, she had a folder waiting. Inside were copies of HOA financial statements, bank records, and correspondence between Richard and a landscaping contractor. "Take a look at this," she said, pointing to a column of numbers. Over the last 4 years, the HOA paid more than $100,000 to a company called Ridgeview Maintenance. Only problem is, Ridgeview doesn't exist. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's a shell. The payments were deposited into an account under the name R. Hale Management Services. He's been embezzling HOA dues for years." I stared at the papers, stunned. "You're saying he's been stealing from the residents?" Lisa nodded. "And using the HOA to cover it up. This isn't just a civil matter anymore, Sarah. It's criminal." She forwarded everything to the county prosecutor's office. Within 48 hours, the tone of the entire situation shifted. The lawsuit he'd filed against me was suddenly the least of his concerns. 2 investigators arrived at my house that week to take my statement. They'd already subpoenaed HOA financial records and interviewed several board members. What they uncovered made my ordeal look small in comparison. Missing funds, falsified invoices, even personal expenses disguised as community improvements. When word spread through the neighborhood, people were shocked. The same man who fined families for leaving their trash cans out too long had been stealing from them all along. The whispers that once followed me now followed him. Still, I couldn't relax. Justice moves slowly, and Richard was the kind of man who clung to power until his fingers bled. Every night, I half expected another envelope, another threat, another battle waiting at my door. But this time, the storm wasn't coming for me. That final morning began like any other. Lily was at school, Mark was making coffee, and sunlight spilled across the kitchen table. Then a sound broke through the calm. Sirens, getting closer. I stepped outside, heart pounding, as 2 county sheriff cruisers turned onto our street. They stopped right in front of Richard Hale's house. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering as deputies walked up his driveway. Moments later, Richard appeared in the doorway, face pale, hands trembling. I watched as they read him his rights. Legal nugget under state law. Misappropriating HOA funds or falsifying community financial records constitutes felony embezzlement. And then, for the first time since the war began, I felt something like peace. Then one morning, flashing lights filled our street, and Richard Hale was led away in handcuffs. The courtroom smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. Sterile, silent, heavy with tension. Months of investigation had led to this day, and as I sat beside Lisa Monroe, I felt every heartbeat echo in my ears. Across the room, Richard Hale sat stiffly between his attorneys, the confident smirk he once wore now replaced by a hollow stare. When the judge entered, everyone rose. My palms were damp. I told myself to breathe, but my chest felt like stone. Case number 4721, the clerk announced. State of Maple County versus Richard Hale. The prosecution's statement was short but devastating. They laid out everything: the shell company, the missing HOA dues, the fraudulent citations. Then they played the footage again: Tom Becker tampering with the well, the HOA's letters, the financial records tying everything back to Richard. When the judge finally spoke, his words cut through the silence like a blade. Mr. Hale, this court finds you guilty of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of authority under state statute. A gasp rippled through the room. Richard's head fell forward. I felt my breath leave me in a single rush. Not joy, not triumph, but release. He was sentenced to prison and ordered to repay the stolen funds to the community. The HOA itself was fined and forced into restructuring under county supervision. But the residents of Maple Ridge wanted more than oversight. They wanted freedom. A month later, the community held a vote in the same clubhouse where this all began. The result was unanimous. The Homeowners Association was dissolved. The bylaws, the fines, the fear, gone. Standing outside afterward, the air felt different, lighter. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months greeted one another again. Kids played in driveways. Water flowed freely from sprinklers, sparkling under the afternoon sun. Mark put his arm around my shoulders, smiling quietly. "It's finally over," he said. I nodded, watching the sunlight glint off the well in the distance. "It's over," I whispered, though part of me wasn't sure I believed it yet. Because even after justice was served, after the lies, the lawsuits, the sleepless nights, one question lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. But even after justice, one question haunted me. What if I hadn't fought back? When the dust finally settled, Maple Ridge no longer looked like the place where my nightmare began. The fences were still white, the lawns still green, but something invisible had changed. The weight of fear had lifted. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community again, not a kingdom ruled by one man's ego. Standing by the well one evening, I listened to the quiet hum of the pump, the same sound that used to fill me with dread. Now it was different. It was steady, peaceful, alive. That little patch of land had become more than property. It was proof that when you refuse to bow, even the smallest voice can turn into a roar. I often think back on everything that happened: the notices, the fines, the courtroom, the sleepless nights wondering if I was doing the right thing. I learned that justice isn't clean or easy. It's slow, painful, and full of doubt. But I also learned something else. Courage doesn't mean being fearless. It means standing up even when your hands shake. If there's one lesson I'd leave anyone watching this, it's this: know your rights. Don't assume your HOA, your city, or any authority automatically owns what they control. Legal nugget number 9. Always verify what your HOA actually owns. Don't assume control equals authority. A few signatures on paper can change everything, but only if you have the courage to look for the truth. Mark once told me he wished none of this had happened. I understand what he meant, but in a strange way, I'm grateful it did. It showed me that ownership isn't just about deeds or titles, it's about self-respect. About not letting anyone decide what you're allowed to deserve. So to anyone out there dealing with HOA harassment or abuse, I want to hear your story. Ever faced HOA abuse? Tell me your story below. What would you do if your water vanished overnight? Because maybe your fight, like mine, will wake up a community that forgot what freedom felt like. And if you think this story was unbelievable, wait until you hear what happened next.